There's a certain kind of person who wields politeness like a weapon. They wrap their insults in concern, their demands in civility. Their smile is a bared blade, gleaming with condescension. I'd spent 20 years navigating boardrooms filled with them, and I could smell the type from a mile away. Victoria Sterling, standing on my grandmother Eleanor's porch, was a master of the art. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice smooth and cool as riverstone. She held a sheaf of papers in a hand, adorned with a single, offensively large diamond. "I do hope I'm not disturbing you." A lie, right out of the gate. Disturbing me was the entire point of her visit. I watched her from the old rocking chair, the one my grandfather had built and Eleanor had worn to a silken finish over half a century. I didn't get up. I just rocked, slow and steady, letting the familiar groan of the old wood speak for me. Out on the lake, the water was a sheet of hammered steel under the late afternoon sky. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth, the scent of my own sanity slowly returning. Victoria's smile tightened by a fraction. She wasn't accustomed to being ignored. "As you know," she continued, pressing on, "the Lakeshore Estates Homeowners Association has certain standards." I stopped rocking. "I know you have standards, Victoria. I'm not sure you know what they mean." Her mask of civility slipped, just for a second. A flicker of raw annoyance crossed her face before being smoothed over. "The document is quite clear," she said, extending the papers toward me. "It wasn't an offering, it was a threat. This property is in violation of 17 aesthetic and structural bylaws. This is a final notice." I didn't take the papers. I looked past her, to the identical McMansions that had sprouted like a fungal infection around our lake, each one a monument to beige conformity. My cabin, built from local cedar back when this was all just forest, was an affront to their suburban perfection. It had character, it had history, it had a soul. To them, that just made it an eyesore. 17, huh? You've been busy. "We are giving you 30 days, she said, her voice dropping into a tone of theatrical gravity. 30 days to vacate the premises before the lien is executed and the property is seized by the association. Lien. Seizure. The words were clinical, sterile. They were meant to sound official, inevitable. But I knew what they really meant. They meant she was trying to steal my home, my grandmother's home, the only ground that had felt solid beneath my feet since my world had shattered 3 months ago. The irony was so thick I could taste it. I'd walked away from a corporate battlefield, from a marriage that had become a series of hostile negotiations, seeking peace, and I had walked right into another war, a war over peeling paint and the length of my grass. But it was worse than that. I knew it was. This wasn't just Victoria Sterling on a power trip. This was a coordinated attack. Just this morning, a poison pen email, courtesy of the HOA, had landed in my inbox. It was a masterpiece of manufactured outrage, with the developer Marcus Thorne's oily fingerprints all over it. He and Victoria were quite the pair. He built the flimsy castles, and she ruled the plastic kingdom. The email, sent to everyone in the neighborhood, claimed my antiquated septic system. Eleanor's meticulously maintained system was a ticking time bomb, leaching filth into their precious lake. They weren't just trying to evict me. They were trying to make me a villain, a pariah, the unstable divorcee in the old shack who was poisoning their children's swimming water. It was a classic corporate takedown strategy. Isolate your target, destroy their reputation, then move in for the kill. My silence seemed to fuel Victoria's confidence. She placed the papers on the small table beside my chair with a soft, final thud. "We trust you'll make the sensible choice, Liam," she said, using my first name for the first time. It was another calculated move, a power play meant to signal a false intimacy, as if this were all just a regrettable misunderstanding between equals. We were not equals. She was a predator who had mistaken grief for weakness. I let my gaze drift back to the lake, to the far shore where a single ancient pine stood, taller than all the others. A memory surfaced. Eleanor sitting right where I was, her eyes twinkling. "It's all just worthless swampland, Liam," she'd say, winking like she was letting me in on the world's greatest secret. Never forget that. For years I'd thought it was just her humble way of talking, a defense against pride, but now, standing on the precipice of losing it all, The words felt different. They felt heavier, like a clue. Victoria turned to leave, her designer heels clicking a sharp, triumphant rhythm on the old pine boards. She thought she had won. She thought the game was over. She'd delivered her ultimatum, painted her target, and set the clock ticking on my defeat. She had no idea that the clock had just started for her. She had declared war on a man who had nothing left to lose, and she had done it on the porch of a woman who, I was beginning to suspect, had been far, far smarter than anyone ever knew. Victoria Sterling thought she was stealing a worthless cabin on a worthless piece of land. She was about to find out just how wrong she was. The sharp click-clack of Victoria Sterling's heels faded down the gravel path, leaving behind a silence that was louder than any argument. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, filled with the weight of her threats. 30 days. The words echoed in the space she'd vacated. 30 days to watch my world shrink, to see the legacy my grandparents had built with sweat and cedar be dismantled by a homeowners association. I sank back into the old rocker, the eviction notice lying on the table beside me like a coiled snake. The paper felt cold, alien, on the warm, familiar wood. For a long moment, I just sat there, watching the sun bleed out across the lake, painting the water in shades of bruised purple and angry orange. The loons had gone quiet. Even the forest seemed to be holding its breath. The initial rage had burned itself out, leaving behind the cold, gray ash of despair. How could I fight this? I was one man, still reeling from a life that had come undone, against a committee with a war chest funded by 47 households. They had lawyers on retainer, they had rules, bylaws, and the sheer grinding momentum of bureaucracy on their side. What did I have? A cabin full of memories and a rapidly dwindling bank account. My hand drifted to my phone. There was only one person to call. The phone rang 3 times before a gruff, familiar voice answered. Arthur Carter. Uncle Arthur, I said, my own voice sounding thin, defeated. It's Liam. Liam, I was just thinking about you. How's the lake? I let out a short, bitter laugh. The lake is fine. It's the sharks circling it that are the problem. I spent the next 10 minutes laying it all out for him. The HOA, Victoria Sterling, the eviction notice, the septic system lie, the 30-day clock ticking like a bomb in the center of my life. I expected him to sigh, to tell me about the uphill battle I was facing, the cost, the sheer exhaustion of it all. Instead, he was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't sympathetic. It was sharp, focused. It was the voice of the lawyer who had spent 40 years staring down corporate giants and winning. A lien, you said, and a public accusation of environmental contamination? Yes, it's a full-on assault. No, Arthur corrected me. It's not an assault. It's a mistake, a big one. People like Victoria Sterling, these petty tyrants, they get so high on their own power, they get sloppy. They overplay their hand. He paused. Your grandmother? Eleanor was one of the shrewdest women I ever knew. She wasn't just sentimental about that land, Liam. She was strategic. She wouldn't have left you vulnerable. What do you mean? I mean, she wouldn't have left you a house without the weapons to defend it. The law is a fortress, son, but you need the key. Eleanor would have left you a key. You just have to find it. Stop looking at the papers they gave you and start looking for the ones she left for you. His words hung in the air long after we'd hung up. A key. That night, sleep was a stranger. I paced the cabin's small rooms, the floorboards groaning under my feet like old friends sharing my anxiety. Every object seemed to hold a memory, a piece of Eleanor, her reading glasses still on the nightstand, her favorite quilt draped over the armchair, her scent, a faint mix of vanilla and cedar, still clinging to the air in the closet. I felt like a ghost in my own life, haunting the remnants of a past I was about to lose. The search began in the attic the next morning. It was a dusty, sun-drenched time capsule filled with boxes labeled in Eleanor's elegant looping script. Christmas ornaments, 58 to 72. Liam's school projects, old photographs. I spent hours sifting through a lifetime of carefully preserved sentiment, my heart aching with a fresh wave of grief. It was all here, except for anything that looked like a legal document. No deeds, no surveys, no wills, nothing. By afternoon, I was covered in dust and frustration. I sat on an old trunk, the single attic window painting a golden square on the floor, feeling the last embers of hope dying out. Arthur had to be wrong. She was just a sweet old woman who loved her home. She wasn't a strategist. She hadn't prepared for a war she never could have seen coming. Defeated, I picked up a small, leather-bound book from a box of what she'd labeled personal effects. It was her diary. I'd never dared to read it when she was alive. It felt like an invasion of her privacy. But now it felt like the only part of her I could still talk to. I opened it to a random page, dated July 1960. Her handwriting was a comfort. I read about her garden, about a fishing trip with my grandfather, about the simple joys of her life. But then, a few pages later, a different tone emerged. Marcus Thorne Sr. came by again today. That man has the persistence of a hornet and the soul of a vulture. He wants our land. He sees a future of houses and roads, not trees and water. He offered an insulting sum. George politely showed him the door. But I see a hunger in that man's eyes that won't be satisfied. We must be prepared. My blood ran cold. Thorne? The same family? This wasn't a new fight. It was an old one, a generational one. I flipped through the pages, my hands trembling slightly. The entries were sporadic, but they painted a picture of a quiet, cold war. The Thornes trying to buy them out, trying to claim easements, trying to wear them down. And then I found it. An entry from the spring of 1961, shortly after they had finished building the cabin. The foundation is set, not just in stone, but in ink. George thinks I worry too much, but a woman knows. A fortress is only as strong as its hidden walls. I've made sure ours are deep and unseen. Should the wolves ever circle, the key is where our story began. When the sun licks the cheek of the oldest giant, its shadow will point the way home. A riddle. My heart hammered against my ribs. Arthur was right. This was it. This was the key. The oldest giant. That had to be the massive ancient white pine that stood on the western edge of the property, the one my grandfather had refused to cut down when he cleared the land. It was a landmark, a sentinel, the cheek of the oldest giant. What did that mean? I spent the rest of the afternoon staring at that tree, walking around it, trying to see it through her eyes. It was just a tree, a big old tree. The sun began its slow descent, and I was ready to give up. I sat on a fallen log, watching the light filter through the canopy. And then I saw it. As the sun dipped lower, its light hit a specific spot on the trunk, about 20 feet up. A large, round knot, smoother than the surrounding bark, looked for all the world like a weathered cheek on a giant's face. The light didn't just hit it, it seemed to caress it. The sun licks the cheek. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes fixed on the ground. The tree's shadow, long and impossibly dark in the fading light, stretched across the forest floor. It crept over moss and fallen leaves, a silent pointing finger. And its tip, its very tip, landed directly on the stone threshold of the old workshop. Its shadow will point the way home, not the cabin, the workshop, the place my grandfather had spent countless hours, the place that always smelled of sawdust and turpentine, the place I hadn't set foot in for years. The door groaned open on rusted hinges. The air inside was thick, still, and heavy with the ghosts of forgotten projects. A thick layer of dust covered everything. I found an old flashlight, its beam cutting a weak yellow cone through the gloom. I walked to the back, to the heavy workbench my grandfather had built into the very wall of the structure. I ran my hands over its scarred surface, then knelt down, shining the light underneath. Just dirt and cobwebs. My heart sank. Had I gotten it wrong? Was this all just the desperate ramblings of a grieving man? But Eleanor was meticulous. I thought about the riddle again, the way home. A home has a foundation. I started tapping the flagstones that made up the workshop floor. Tap, tap, thud, tap, tap, thud. And then, near the back leg of the workbench, hidden in the deepest shadow, tap, tap, thump. A hollow sound. My breath caught in my throat. Using the claw of an old hammer, I pried at the edge of the stone. It was heavy, but it moved. Grunting with effort, I lifted it away. And there, nestled in the cool, dark earth beneath, was a metal strongbox. It was old, army green, and locked tight. It took me 20 minutes of frantic searching through rusty coffee cans filled with old nuts and bolts before I found it, a small brass key, tucked away in a tiny velvet pouch. It fit the lock perfectly, with a turn that felt momentous, a click that echoed through the silent workshop like a gunshot. The lock sprang open. My hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from a wild, surging hope. I lifted the heavy lid. It groaned open, releasing the faint, clean scent of old paper and dry cedar. And inside, lying on a bed of faded blue velvet, was not just a stack of documents. It was the first shot in a war my grandmother had prepared for more than 60 years ago. The air in the workshop, once heavy with dust and defeat, now crackled with a strange electric energy. My hands, which had been shaking with desperation just an hour before, were now steady. The contents of the strongbox weren't just old papers. They were a testament, a fortress, just as Eleanor had written. I lifted the first document from its velvet bed. It was a large, rolled-up piece of drafting linen, yellowed with age but still crisp. I carried it over to my grandfather's workbench, clearing a space amidst the clutter of forgotten tools. With careful hands, I unrolled it. The scent of old ink and paper filled the small space. It was a map. But not just any map. It was a hand-drawn property survey from 1961, the lines rendered with an artist's precision. Every tree, every contour of the land, every measurement was documented in my grandfather's neat, architectural script. I traced the boundaries with my finger, my heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. The lines matched the county records I'd seen online, for the most part, but then my finger reached the eastern edge of the property, the side that bordered the new lakeshore estates, and it just kept going. The line didn't stop where the manicured lawns of the HOA began. It extended another 200 feet, a thick, confident slash of ink that sliced right through what I'd always assumed was community property. It encompassed the gravel parking area, yes, but it also encompassed something far more critical. The road. The single paved, two-lane road that served as the only entrance and exit for all 47 homes in Marcus Thorne's plastic kingdom. He had built his multi-million-dollar development on a road he didn't own. Eleanor had let him. She had watched him pave over her land, knowing that every shovelful of asphalt was forging another link in a chain she held in her hand. I felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the very ground beneath me had shifted. This wasn't just leverage. This was a checkmate move, played 60 years in advance. Beneath the map was a thick legal-sized folder tied with a faded ribbon. The label on it read, Water and Riparian Rights. Inside, sheaf after sheaf of brittle paper detailed the history of the lake. They were deeds and patents dating back to the late 1800s, showing a clear, unbroken chain of private ownership. The lake had never been ceded to the state. It had been passed down from owner to owner until it landed with my grandparents. I didn't just own the land on the lake. I owned the lake itself. Every boat slip, every swimming dock, every inch of water Victoria Sterling was charging residents to use belonged to me. But it was the last item in the box that took my breath away. A single folded letter addressed in Eleanor's hand. My dearest Liam. The ink had faded slightly, but her words were as clear and sharp as her mind had always been. If you are reading this, then the wolves have come to the door, just as I always knew they would. Do not be afraid, and do not grieve for what you think you have to do. This land is more than dirt and trees. It is our story, and you are its guardian now. I let Mr. Thorne build his road. I watched him do it. Some might call it foolish. I call it an insurance policy. Men like him believe that possession is everything. They are wrong. The law, my dear boy, is everything, and the law is on our side. The documents in this box are your shield and your sword. Do not be afraid to use them. They cannot take what is ours. They cannot even leave their own homes without our permission. Be wise, be strong, and know that I am with you. All my love, Eleanor. I folded the letter, my hands no longer shaking. A profound calm washed over me. The despair was gone, burned away by the fierce, protective love of a woman who was still fighting for her family, even from beyond the grave. She hadn't just left me a cabin, she had left me a fortress, a strategy, and the courage to see it through. I picked up my phone and dialed. Arthur Carter. Uncle Arthur, I said, and my voice was different now. The thin, defeated tone was gone, replaced by something colder, harder. Something I hadn't heard in myself in a very long time. I found the key. I could almost hear his smile through the phone. I knew she wouldn't let you down. What have you got, son? I've got the road, I said, and I've got the lake. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. It was the sound of a 40-year veteran of property law, realizing he was holding a royal flush. Oh, my boy, Arthur finally breathed, a note of pure, unadulterated glee in his voice. Oh, my dear boy, this isn't a fight. This is going to be a goddamn masterpiece. The discovery in the strongbox had armed me, but it hadn't made me bulletproof. A man can hold a winning hand and still get shot before he has a chance to play it. That was the thought that kept me up at night, staring at the moonlit ceiling of Eleanor's cabin. Uncle Arthur and I spent the next 2 days on the phone, plotting our strategy with the precision of generals planning an invasion. The plan was simple, elegant, and brutal. We wouldn't fire the first shot. We would let Victoria Sterling and Marcus Thorne walk right into the kill zone. We'd let them schedule their meeting, make their public accusations, and rally their troops. We would let them build their own gallows. Patience, Liam, Arthur had coached, his voice a low growl of anticipation. Let her feel confident, let her think she has you cornered. The more public she makes her victory lap, the more devastating her fall will be. It was a sound strategy, a lawyer's strategy. But a lawyer doesn't have to live on the battlefield. While I was quietly assembling my legal arsenal, Victoria, sensing a shift in my demeanor, the absence of fear perhaps, decided to abandon legal pretense and resort to scorched earth warfare. The attack, when it came, wasn't a letter from a lawyer. It was a whisper campaign, as toxic and pervasive as an invisible gas. It started with David Chen. David lived 3 houses down. He'd been the first to welcome me to the neighborhood, showing up with a 6-pack of beer and a friendly smile. He was a quiet guy, an accountant, and we'd bonded over our shared misery of recent messy divorces. I'd told him things you only tell a man you think is a friend, sitting on a dock in the twilight. I'd told him about the anger, the hurt, the feeling of being blindsided. I had, in my grief, handed my enemy a weapon, and they used it with surgical cruelty. Suddenly, the neighborhood chatter changed. I'd see small groups fall silent as I walked past to check my mail. I'd catch the pitying, fearful glances from across the street. The story, twisted and amplified by Victoria's rumor mill, was that I wasn't just a grieving man. I was an unstable one, an angry, unpredictable man with a history of conflict. My refusal to bow to the HOA wasn't a principled stand. It was proof of my antisocial, potentially dangerous nature. The septic system lie was now interwoven with the narrative of my personal life. My reckless disregard for the environment was a symptom of my overall emotional instability. It was brilliant in a sickening sort of way. They were no longer just attacking my property. They were attacking my character, my very sanity. The walls began to feel like they were closing in. The quiet sanctuary of the lake began to feel like a fishbowl. Then came the official knock on the door. Not from Victoria, but from 2 tired-looking officials in stiff, government-issued jackets. The Environmental Protection Agency. Victoria had followed through on her threat, filing a formal complaint. For the next 3 hours, they tramped through my property. They took water samples from the lakefront. They inspected every pipe and joint of Eleanor's septic system. They carried clipboards and wore expressions of grim duty. It was a violation, a quiet, bureaucratic violation that was somehow more unnerving than Victoria's open hostility. They were polite, professional, but their very presence was an accusation. I was a suspect in my own home. I watched them from the porch, my hands clenched into fists in my pockets, the calm I'd felt after finding the strongbox evaporating under the heat of official scrutiny. As they were packing up to leave, the senior agent, a man with weary eyes who looked like he'd seen it all, pulled me aside. "Off the record, Mr. Carter," he said, his voice low. "We get calls like this all the time. HOA disputes. Someone doesn't like their neighbor's fence, so they claim there's a toxic waste dump in the backyard." He sighed. "Your system is old, but it's solid. Better built than most of these new ones, frankly. We'll have to run the tests, but I wouldn't lose any sleep over it. He gave me a look that was part pity, part respect. Good luck. Looks like you're gonna need it. His words were a small comfort, but the damage was done. By evening, the entire neighborhood knew the EPA had been at my cabin. The visit wasn't proof of my innocence. It was confirmation of their fears. See, it's serious. The government is involved. The lowest point came 2 days later. I was sitting on the dock, trying to find a moment of peace when I saw Maria Flores walking toward me. She was a kind, grandmotherly woman who lived on the other side of the lake. She always had a wave and a smile for me, but today her face was etched with worry. She sat down beside me on the old sun-bleached planks. For a moment, we just watched the water. "Liam," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "I have to tell you something. I don't like getting involved, but this is not right." She told me she'd been at a small get-together at Victoria's house the night before, a community safety meeting. She said David Chen had been there, and he had been holding court. He was telling them things, Maria said, unable to meet my eyes. About your divorce, personal things. He told them you said you wanted to make her pay. He said you had a temper. Victoria was just eating it up, telling everyone that's why they needed to act fast before you did something destructive. A cold, heavy knot formed in my stomach. The betrayal was so profound, so complete, it left me breathless. The beer on the dock, the shared stories. It was all a lie, an intelligence-gathering operation. But that's not all, Maria continued, reaching into her purse. She pulled out her phone. I was in the kitchen getting a glass of water. They didn't know I was there. I heard them talking, Victoria and David. She pressed play. The recording was slightly muffled, but their voices were clear. Victoria's voice. The details were perfect, David. The make her pay line was a masterstroke. Really paints the picture of instability. David's voice smug. "Happy to help, Victoria." "So, we're good on the variance from my deck extension, right? My wife's been writing me about it." Victoria's voice, like honey laced with arsenic. "Of course. We take care of our friends. Just keep feeding me anything else he tells you. We need to make sure that by the time the final meeting happens, not a single person in this room is on his side." Maria stopped the recording. The silence that followed was broken only by the gentle lapping of the water against the dock. I stared out at the lake, but I didn't see it. I saw only the calculated, casual cruelty of it all. They hadn't just turned my neighbors against me. They had used my own pain, my own vulnerability, as the weapon. "I'm so sorry, Liam," Maria said softly. I finally looked at her and managed a weak, grateful smile. "No, Maria, don't be. You just gave me something I needed." She had. She had reminded me that I wasn't entirely alone, but more than that, she had given me a piece of evidence that shifted the game. This was no longer just a property dispute. It was a conspiracy. It was witness tampering. It was criminal. I walked back to the cabin that evening, feeling like a different man. The hurt was still there, a raw, open wound, but beneath it, the cold resolve had hardened into something else. Something colder, something sharper. The next morning, a certified letter was tacked to my door. It was an official notice. An emergency community meeting was scheduled for Friday night. The agenda was simple: to discuss the ongoing safety and compliance violations of the Carter property and to vote on a final resolution. They had scheduled my public execution. They had no idea I was the one bringing the rope. The drive to the community center on Friday evening felt strangely serene. The world outside my truck window was painted in the soft, forgiving hues of twilight, a stark contrast to the cold, hard knot of resolve in my gut. Every streetlight I passed seemed to spotlight another memory. Eleanor teaching me to ride a bike on this very stretch of road. My grandfather pointing out constellations in the clear night sky. They weren't just attacking a piece of property. They were trying to erase a lifetime. My lifetime, theirs. The community center parking lot was already full. I saw the cars of my neighbors, people I'd shared polite waves with for months, now gathered to cast their vote on my expulsion. And as I pulled my truck into a spot near the back, on land that, according to the map in my briefcase, belonged to me, I saw him. Sheriff Martinez. He wasn't inside. He was leaning against his patrol car, arms crossed, watching the residents file in. His presence was a calculated piece of theater by Victoria, meant to intimidate me and lend an air of official gravity to her kangaroo court. He gave me a long, unreadable look as I walked past. I just gave a slight nod. The time for words would come later. Inside, the air was thick enough to chew. It smelled of burnt coffee, cheap air freshener, and a potent, collective anxiety. The room was packed, folding chairs squeaking in protest under the weight of 52 residents. It was a sea of familiar faces, now twisted with suspicion and resentment. They looked at me as I entered, and I could see the effectiveness of Victoria's campaign in their eyes. I wasn't Liam Carter, their neighbor. I was the threat, the unstable element, the man who was going to ruin everything. At the front of the room, a long table had been set up like a judge's bench. Victoria Sterling sat in the center, a vision of corporate power in a crisp navy blazer and pearls. She radiated a triumphant, unshakable confidence. To her right sat her lawyer, a man named Bradley Pearson, whose suit cost more than my truck, and whose smile looked like it had been bought on credit. To her left sat Marcus Thorne, the developer, looking deeply uncomfortable, like a man forced to attend a trial where he knew he was one of the secret co-conspirators. My team, Uncle Arthur, Caleb Vance, and a sharp-eyed environmental lawyer named Dr. Evelyn Reed, whom Arthur had called in as a favor, took seats in the front row, a quiet island of professionalism in a churning sea of suburban drama. Victoria tapped the microphone. The resulting screech silenced the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice resonating with practiced authority. "Thank you for coming to this vital meeting. Tonight, we are here to make a difficult but necessary decision to protect the integrity, safety, and value of our community." For the next 20 minutes, she put on a masterclass in character assassination. A slideshow flickered to life on the screen behind her. There was my cabin, photographed from deliberately unflattering angles, captions like "structural neglect" and "potential hazard" stamped below. There were charts with fabricated numbers showing a projected 20% drop in property values, all attributed to my non-compliance. Then came the personal attacks. She spoke of my documented history of conflict, twisting my refusal to pay her bogus fees into a narrative of antisocial behavior. She brought up my divorce, using carefully selected out-of-context phrases from public records to paint me as volatile. David Chen, sitting in the second row, even stood up to give a short, rehearsed statement about his concerns regarding my erratic behavior and hostile attitude. He couldn't look me in the eye. Victoria let the weight of the accusations settle in the room. The murmurs were on her side. People were nodding. I saw a woman I'd once helped jumpstart her car whisper something to her husband, her face a mask of fear. Victoria had them. She had turned my neighbors into a jury, and she had already convinced them I was guilty. "Therefore," she announced, her voice ringing with the finality of a death sentence, "I move that this board authorize immediate and severe sanctions. Daily fines of $500 until full compliance is achieved, plus the recovery of all legal costs incurred. And if compliance is not met within 7 days, we will proceed with the foreclosure and seizure of the property as outlined in the lien." A man on the board seconded the motion immediately. "All in favor?" Victoria asked, her eyes sweeping the room, already counting her victory. Hands began to go up, and that's when I stood up. My movement was quiet, but it cut through the tension like a knife. Every eye in the room swiveled to me. Victoria's triumphant smile faltered. "Before you vote," I said, my voice calm and even, carrying easily across the suddenly silent room, "I believe there is some additional information you all deserve to hear. Information that has been deliberately withheld from you." On cue, Uncle Arthur rose and walked to the front, placing his heavy leather briefcase on the table. Dr. Reed and Caleb Vance stood up with him. The sight of my team, professional and prepared, sent a ripple of uncertainty through the crowd. This wasn't the broken, isolated man they had been led to expect. "Mrs. Sterling has made some serious claims about my property posing an environmental risk," I continued. "So I asked a professional to look into it. Dr. Reed?" Evelyn Reed, a woman with piercing eyes and an air of no-nonsense intelligence, stepped forward. She didn't use a slideshow. She just spoke. She detailed the results of the EPA's tests. which she had acquired through a formal request. She explained in clear, simple terms that my septic system was not only compliant, but in excellent condition. Then, she presented her own findings from water samples taken all around the lake. The elevated phosphate and coliform levels, she stated, her voice leaving no room for argument, are not originating from the Carter property. They are consistent with runoff and potential system failures from newer constructions, specifically from the drainage patterns of the eastern slope of the lake. She looked directly at Marcus Thorne, the area where all of your homes were built. A shocked murmur went through the room. The foundation of Victoria's argument had just been demolished. "Thank you, Doctor," I said. "Next, the matter of the HOA's authority and finances." I nodded to Uncle Arthur. Arthur, looking more like a friendly college professor than a legal shark, opened his briefcase. He didn't raise his voice. He simply laid out the facts. For the past 3 years, he began, distributing a single-page summary to the board members. The Lakeshore HOA has been collecting fees for lake access and boat slip rentals. Is that correct, Mrs. Sterling? Of course, Victoria snapped, recovering slightly. They are community amenities. An interesting choice of words, Arthur mused. Because according to the official state water management records and the original land patents, dating back to 1891, Blackwater Lake has never been a community amenity. It is, and has always been, privately owned. The silence in the room was absolute. The water you swim in, the docks you tie your boats to, all of it belongs to the estate of Eleanor Carter, and now to her grandson, Liam Carter. He let that sink in. Which means for 3 years, this HOA has been illegally operating a commercial enterprise on Mr. Carter's private property, collecting, by our estimate, over $200,000 in fraudulent fees. The room erupted. People were shouting, looking at their neighbors, looking at Victoria with dawning horror. They hadn't been paying for an amenity. They'd been paying tribute to a thief. That's absurd, Victoria stammered, her face turning a blotchy red. The developer is another matter, I said, stepping forward again. This part was mine to deliver. Let's talk about what the developer built. Caleb Vance wheeled a large monitor to the front and powered it on. A high-resolution satellite image of our neighborhood appeared, overlaid with brilliant colored lines. This is a real-time GPS boundary survey, accurate to within 1 inch, Caleb announced. He pointed to a large, kidney-shaped area colored in bright blue. This is the Carter property, according to the original, legally filed 1961 survey. He zoomed in. The blue area clearly covered the gravel parking lot. Gasps rippled through the crowd as people realized they had parked their cars on my land to come vote me out of my home. But Caleb wasn't done. He traced a thick, impossible red line on the map, a line that ran right down the center of the only paved road leading into the entire subdivision. And this, I said, my voice dropping but carrying to every corner of the room, also belongs to me. I looked out at the sea of stunned, horrified faces. I looked at Marcus Thorne, whose face had gone the color of ash. I looked at Bradley Pearson, who was discreetly sliding his briefcase off the table. And finally, I looked at Victoria Sterling, whose entire world had just been reduced to rubble. I let the silence stretch, letting the full weight of the revelation crush them. So, before you cast your vote on whether or not I get to stay, I said softly, you might want to consider a more pressing question. I paused, making eye contact with as many of them as I could. Starting tomorrow, how do all of you plan to get home? The silence that fell over the room was a physical thing. It was heavier than the humid night air, deeper than the lake outside. It was the sound of 52 different versions of reality shattering at the exact same moment. My question, how do all of you plan to get home, hung in the air, not as a threat, but as a simple, devastating statement of fact. Victoria Sterling, who had stood so tall and righteous just moments before, seemed to shrink. The color drained from her face, leaving behind a pasty, slack-jawed mask of disbelief. The pearls at her throat seemed to be choking her. Marcus Thorne, the developer, looked like a man who had just seen the ghost of every corner he'd ever cut. He was already inching away from the table, a rat trying to flee a ship he himself had scuttled. Then, the silence broke. It wasn't an explosion. It was 1,000 tiny fractures. A woman in the front row turned to her husband and whispered, "My God, he owns the road." The whisper spread, a wildfire of dawning comprehension. Voices rose, not in anger at me, but in a furious, betrayed chorus directed at the two people at the front of the room. "You sold us houses we can't even get to?" someone shouted at Thorne. "You took our money for a lake that wasn't yours?" Another yelled at Victoria. Sheriff Martinez, who had been a silent observer until now, stepped forward. His presence wasn't for me anymore. He walked slowly to the front table, his gaze fixed on Marcus Thorne. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of steel, "I think you and I need to have a long talk about fraudulent plat filings and public right-of-way." That was my cue to offer a different path. Revenge is a fire that burns the person holding it as much as the person it's thrown at. Eleanor hadn't left me this power so I could become another tyrant. She'd left it so I could build something better. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, and the room quieted again, their anger giving way to a desperate, uncertain hope. They looked at me now, not as an enemy, but as the only person in the room who held any answers. "My grandmother loved this lake," I said simply. "She believed it was a gift, a place for peace, not for profit. What has happened here? This is not what she would have wanted." Uncle Arthur stepped forward and began handing out a new document. It was a one-page proposal. "I'm not interested in lawsuits or evictions," I continued, letting my eyes drift over the faces of my neighbors. "I'm interested in a solution. I am proposing the formation of the Eleanor Carter Land Trust." I laid out the terms. The road and the lake would be placed into the trust. Every household would be granted a permanent, legal easement for access in exchange for a modest annual fee, less than half of what the HOA had been charging. The fee wouldn't go to me. It would go into the trust, managed by a board of 5 elected community members, to be used for road maintenance, environmental protection of the lake, and community improvements. "The boat slips will be managed the same way," I said. "Fair rates with all proceeds funding the health of the water we all share. This isn't about me owning you. It's about all of us taking responsibility for this place, together." It was an offer of peace, an olive branch extended over the ashes of Victoria's fallen kingdom. The vote, when it came, was unanimous. A quiet, humbled, and deeply relieved "aye" echoed through the room. The aftermath was swift. Victoria Sterling's reign ended not with a bang, but with a whimper. Faced with a civil lawsuit from the residents for fraud and an official investigation by the State Attorney General's office for embezzlement, she sold her house at a significant loss and was gone within a month. I never saw her again. Marcus Thorne was buried in an avalanche of legal trouble. He settled with the homeowners for a massive sum to avoid further prosecution, a settlement that provided the initial seed money for the Land Trust's environmental cleanup fund. But the real change wasn't legal or financial. It was human. The first project we tackled was the drainage problem, the very issue they had tried to pin on me. Men who had glared at me with suspicion a month earlier were now standing shoulder to shoulder with me, digging trenches and laying pipe. We hired Dr. Reed as a consultant, and using the trust funds, we built a series of bioswales and retention ponds, a state-of-the-art system that would protect the lake for generations. David Chen came to my door one evening, his head hung low. He offered a halting, shame-faced apology. I didn't forget what he did, but I accepted it. Forgiveness, I was learning, was its own kind of strength. I later saw him volunteering his time to help the Kowalskis rebuild the dock in front of their house. The community, once fractured by suspicion, began to heal. We organized a lake cleanup day, and nearly every family showed up. We pulled old tires from the shallows and cleared invasive weeds. We built a small, sandy beach in a commonly owned area, a place for kids to splash and play safely. Maria Flores organized potluck dinners. We started talking to each other again, not as members of a litigious association, but as neighbors. One afternoon, I was sitting on my porch, sanding down an old piece of furniture, when Chuck Martinez, the veteran Victoria had harassed over his flagpole, walked up with 2 beers in his hand. He didn't say much. We just sat there, watching the sun set, the comfortable silence a testament to the new peace we had all built together. As I sit here now, in Eleanor's old rocking chair, the evening air is filled with different sounds. Not the angry clicks of designer heels on pine boards, but the laughter of children playing on the new community beach, the friendly chatter of neighbors enjoying an evening stroll on a road they now help maintain, the call of the loons on a lake that is cleaner and healthier than it has been in years. Eleanor's letter is framed on my wall now. This land is more than dirt and trees. It is our story, and you are its guardian now. I finally understand what she meant. She didn't leave me a weapon to win a war. She left me the tools to build a lasting peace. She left me not just a piece of property, but a purpose. The legacy wasn't the land itself. It was the opportunity to nurture it, to share it, to make it a place where community wasn't just a word in a legal document, but a living, breathing thing. And in doing so, I didn't just save my grandmother's home. I finally found my own.